Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me once again David Jensen. Welcome, David.
Morning, Jay.
Good to have you with me again. We haven't spoken in a couple of weeks. Just quickly, we like to go over this topic whenever I have you on in terms of the premia of the precious metals markets. They're still out there. I mean, we're not seeing much with gold, but silver's up a little bit. Platinum, palladium's still up more. What do you see? Anything different here, or is this the same story, the same message, essentially?
Well, I mean, what stands out is, in particular, is silver with a 13.3% premium in Shanghai versus London, and palladium with a 17.6% premium versus London. And these premia are enough, are enough to pull gold through smuggling off the international markets into China. So you have the off-market transactions, which would be at a lower price than what would be traded in Shanghai. But what you have to pay on the Shanghai metals markets, the official markets, is substantial enough to pull the physical metal into the market. So that's why we follow it week to week, is to watch these premia. We expect them to go up very strongly as we near a fracture point in the paper trading markets, which are London and New York primarily.
Yeah, virtual markets, as you've called them once, the markets that are really more of a fantasy market than a reality market. The reality market for the real gold and silver is in Shanghai.
Yeah.
And so we really want to see. And so there have been some reports. I mean, what's the latest you've heard in terms of movement of bullion actually into China?
Kuz Jansen has an interesting note out today on his website, and he's posted there that last week the withdrawal from vault at the Shanghai Gold Exchange, which is a domestic exchange. It's not the free trade zone exchange, but the actual domestic exchange. That the withdrawals, physical gold withdrawals from the vaults there, was 68 tons. And so, that's 68,000 kilograms of gold that was withdrawn from the Chinese vault or Shanghai vaults last week. And just in perspective, that exceeds global gold production last week. So they're actually withdrawing more gold from the Chinese vaults than is produced globally from mines in the past week. So it's a very strong demand that is out there for physical metal right now.
Well, it's certainly interesting that there are those cultural differences, whereas in the West we've been pretty much told and taught that gold is a barbaric relic and there's no real reason to want to own the stuff. I mean, it's just really, let's just get rid of it and buy the paper assets. And Jim Rickards has come out. We've had Jim on this show a couple of times in the past. And he's come out and arguing that by 2020, all the gold of the G20 nations will be confiscated and buried in a former nuclear bunker under a mountain in Switzerland to take it out of the global financial system. Well, that sounds like really weird stuff. You know, I've talked to my friend and yours, Larry Parks, and Larry mentioned years ago, he said, well, if the establishment could, if the Western establishment could, they would take all the gold that's ever existed on the face of the earth and ship it to the moon. Well, Rickards is not proposing that because it's impossible, but I guess is he serious about this? Is he really talking about putting gold underneath the mountain somewhere and hiding it away like you would nuclear waste?
Well, it's hard to say. What he's saying here is that, and by the way, Rickards himself, he came from long-term capital management, which in 1999 went bust and created a crisis. The Fed had to step in and bail them out. And he's also, said to have a wide number of contacts in the intelligence establishment and in the U.S. Military establishment. They model financial crises and war scenarios. So, when he says things like this, it's not just Jim, I think, saying these things, and he's kind of putting a feeler out there. So to see, I think, what the reaction is going to be. But I think that ultimately, that I agree with Larry, is that gold is number one, it's money, and number two, it's a primary indicator of paper money inflation or fiat money inflation. And so you want to get gold out of the system if you want to have control of the system. You don't want to give people an option, a plan B. from a central planning perspective, I mean, we know that central planning fails, and we know that especially central planning of the monetary system leads to currency failure and monetary system crisis. And it sounds to me like what he's saying is that we want to remove any kind of a stabilizing system or an option from the system. It's very difficult to see how the G20 could do this. I mean, we know the G20 includes China and India. And I mean, first of all, we know the Indian affinity for gold, and the Chinese have had a multi-decade policy here of securing gold to back their monetary system. So very difficult, first of all, to see how that can happen. Maybe there's a crisis in the gold market and he wants to shake some people out of the trees that are gold investors. I don't know. But we do know that, that historically that totalitarian regimes, Hitler and Stalin both spoke about how much they detested gold, and I'm sure that anybody that wants to create a controlled monetary system would also detest gold, in terms of it's not centrally controlled, and it's not something that the government can reach into to assert influence over people through.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems ironic to me, David, that in fact countries like China and Russia, which have been known as totalitarian countries, and which, as you point out, were against gold and made it illegal to own the stuff, that now it's us that are pushing in that direction. It seems to be the West and the ruling elite especially that seems to be craving for totalitarian control. And meantime, we see both China and Russia endorsing gold ownership and at least importing huge amounts of gold into their systems. It seems to me also in Russia, where you have a 17% flat tax. I mean, if taxation is confiscation of private property, then it looks to me like Russia's a better place to be right now from that standpoint than we are, because my tax rates are a heck of a lot higher than 17%. I'll tell you that. But getting back to gold, then, this is really interesting stuff, because we're really looking at what it's just really very important, because I can't get out of my head this Rickard's idea about just getting rid of gold, confiscation of gold. Do you think that's what they've got in mind?
Well, he has a message there, which is don't go into gold. If you really distill it down to its essential message, there is that it's not going to do you any good because they're going to take it all, right? Mm-hmm. So he's saying buy fine art and buy this and buy that, but you're dealing with centuries of history of looking at gold as a monetary metal and as a safe haven. And I mean, there were really three historical metals that were monetary metals. One is gold, one is silver, and the other one is copper. Mm-hmm. And copper was actually a monetary metal in history. So, okay, we take the gold away. Well, then people are going to buy silver, and take the silver away, they're going to buy copper. Mm-hmm. And so, what are they? What is he really proposing here? It really is more of a signal to me to see how people react, and it's probably trying to shake people out of the gold tree. I suspect that there's liquidity issues out there in the physical market behind the scenes, that there's scrambling going on. So, but the whole idea of attacking gold just advertises the failure of central planners. And I can't help but think of, in the 1950s when Mao Zedong, they were having problems with their production of wheat, and that he blamed it on sparrows, right? And so what
was the logic of that, David?
Well, the sparrows were eating the grain.
I see.
And as a consequence, we have a shortage, and so half the able-bodied workers and children and old people went around killing sparrows for months. And I mean, what happened was that they ended up with a locust plague after that, because the sparrows had been eating the locusts, and so but they ended up in the end with a combination of central planning of their farm economy and removal of incentives of production, as well as a plague of locusts, and they ended up with tens of millions of people dying from starvation.
Yeah, unintended consequences of central planning, and that's just one example. We've got them now, of course, in the capital markets in the United States and around the world. untold damage that's being caused right now by
Sure.
misallocation of savings and capital. It's horrible. It's
Yeah. So
horrible.
you go after the measurement devices, right, which is gold, and you go after the Plan Bs, which is gold. But you don't deal with the issue itself, which is that your system is broken and your system doesn't work and never has worked. And if you want to use another example, you might as well confiscate thermometers. With the polar vortex last year, the cold temperatures notionally caused a decline in Q1 GDP, according to the major financial circles. And we should maybe take away the measurement device, which is a thermometer of temperature, and maybe that'll cause people not to realize that there's a problem. So,
Well, I think that's exactly why they want to take away gold, because it is a measurement of the economic temperature, if you will.
yes, yeah, and I mean, Alan Greenspan commented on that in the early 90s. We have the Fed minutes where he said it would, he likened gold to a thermometer, but he also said that it could influence the temperature, and it would be very interesting to see what would happen if you could adjust that thermometer or influence that thermometer in terms of the behavior of people.
Mm-hmm.
So we know it's an active thought of the central planners, central bankers, the monetary system controllers, and ultimately, you control the monetary system to control people.
Yeah, and here's the thing about this whole discussion, David, that I find really troubling. America was supposed to be a free market economy. I mean, the revolution of 1776, when I was young, we at least admired Adam Smith's free markets, and now it seems as though all of the rhetoric that comes out of our mainstream media, all of the programmed thinking, or let's say, I don't think they're teaching us to think, they're teaching us to follow the leader, to give up our individuality and our individual thoughts. It seems to me, it smacks of treason to me, honestly. I mean,
Yeah.
it just, the whole manipulation of markets. I mean, I think the gold is very central, and it's not even recognized, but I think manipulating gold is really key, as you and I have discussed before, in manipulating interest rates. They have to keep the price of gold down, or else they'll have a hard time in suppressing the interest rates.
Yeah.
But do you see this as as sort of a treasonous issue?
Well, I mean, the definition of treason, I see it as a breach of allegiance to one's country. And when you're undermining the monetary structure and undermining the stability of the financial system, I mean, when these things fail, you have consequences like starvation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the ultimate, that's where it ends up down the road. It doesn't end up there tomorrow. You have gradual inflation at first, but ultimately you have monetary system failure, and then you have all kinds of social chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And manipulating gold, first of all, which is pretty clear, has happened over the last several decades with intensity, and certainly we know that it happened in the '60s with the London Gold Pool. But what has happened here is that they've done it in a very subversive manner that was very, very difficult to see. But ultimately, the manipulation of gold has manipulated global interest rates and manipulated the global debt markets and expanded them to a size which is mind-boggling at about 320% of global GDP. So you have this enormous, you've got more than $100 trillion of excess debt sitting out there, and it has consequences when these debt bubbles fail. So, the intent and the intention here has been really to shut down the warning system, which is gold, and the inflation indicator, which is gold. And that has allowed running a very loose monetary policy for more than a decade, almost 2 decades now, with intensity, and has led to a series of bubbles which has been blown, which has grossly enriched the financial sector, but at the cost to the greater citizenry of our countries. And in the end, if you collapse your currency, it actually threatens the nation state, the sovereign nation state as it stands. So, using the test of a breach of allegiance to your country, it would seem that that they are stepping over those bounds and basically, indeed, are acting in what can be characterized as a treasonous nature, or as an activity against the interests of your nation state.
Okay, who do you think is behind this? Who's doing this? Because when I was a young guy and back in Ohio in the 1950s when I started school, every day I stood up and I put my hand over my heart and I pledged allegiance to the United States of America, for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. That
Yeah.
was what I said every day, and I believed it. I believed that my country was a good country that cared about individual liberties, and that America was special in that regard. I believed that then. I believed it was once true to a greater extent than it is today, anyway. But who is responsible, David? Who's behind this? Now, we've talked about the bullion banks being involved. We've seen these massive smackdowns that you've talked about in the paper market, in the fraudulent paper markets that we have in the United States and London, as opposed to the real markets. But is that where it starts?
Well, I mean, the bullion banks are really an important mechanism for controlling gold. I mean, there was a very interesting article posted in Zero Hedge by Brandon Smith, I believe, of Alt Markets. And the comment was, he said, just a short quote, he said, central bankers and their political proponents espouse a globalist ideology, meaning they are internationalists in their orientation and motivations. They do not have loyalties to any particular country. They do not take an oath to any particular constitution. They do not have empathy for any particular culture or social experiment. They have their own subculture with their own quote-unquote values and their own social hierarchy. They are a kind of tribe or sect, a cult, if you will, that views itself as superior to all others. This means that when the central bankers that run the Fed act, they only act with the intention to support and promote globalization, not the best interests of America and Americans. Now, that might be an extreme view to some, but we have to look at the policy which has gone on by the central bankers, including the Fed, and then really ask, in whose long-term self-interest has it been to blow these monetary bubbles, economic bubbles, and to really, in a precipitous way, threaten the stability of our currencies and ultimately of our society. And it certainly isn't in the interests of the day-to-day citizen to be put through this type of chaos and to be run to massive levels of debt through debt bubbles, and then have these markets that they're invested in crashing right, left, and center.
Yeah.
So it's not in the interests of the average citizen. But we definitely see that the central banks are key to this, and also the bullion banks, and in particular, J. Aaron and Company, with its exception to speculating in the commodities market, which it received in 1991. J.P. Morgan Chase, it's a name that keeps coming up over and over again in terms of their position in the trading of silver on the COMEX. On the LBMA, it is not clear what the levels of the various bullion banks are because of the opaqueness of the LBMA. We don't see the data. But for certain that the bullion banks that are in there are manipulating the markets, and it's a real problem that we have in terms of the LBMA itself is trading 200 million ounces of gold every day, and we know that amount of gold does not exist to be traded. So, but the bullion banks, back again, maybe more specifically, is back to Ferdinand Lipp's book and his discovery that the bullion banks were advising the central banks and really inspiring them on and egging them on to be leasing their gold out into the market. His belief was it was to make the fees on the bullion. But I think if we look at it big picture, the impact on interest rates of a dropping gold price and the ability to print gobs of money and really explode the markets in terms of their price, that would be I think the central interest of the bullion banks is you short circuit gold, you short circuit interest rates, and then you just run it and have a heck of a party for 15 years, while it's going on. So, so I'd say the bullion banks and the central banks are there. And then when we look at the physical market itself, it appears that the Bank of England and the Bank for International Settlement are really at the core of market making and control and coordination of the central bank gold leasing, which has gone on. And the gold leasing has been a silent supply of physical gold into the market. It's been estimated by 4 different individuals who've done analysis on this, including James Turk, being of the order of 1,500 tons a year, or 40% sorry, 60% of global mine supply. But really, at the center of this seems to be the Bank of England and the Bank for International Settlement.
Interesting. Well, yeah, I mean, the BIS is the banker's bank, as they call it, and so that would make complete sense. Yeah, it's very interesting, and I guess really the whole thing here, David, is, where does this thing end, and what evidence and proof do we have, though, that it's a real conspiracy? I mean, I guess conspiracy is a word you got to be careful about, but
Yeah.
what is the intent is one thing, and what are the results? Of course, that's really what matters.
Yeah, I mean, the word conspiracy is a distraction, and it's confusing, and has a number of emotional hooks in it. So it's one which is probably not the best to use, but there's a coordinated activity of the Bank of England and the BIS at the core to steer things in this direction. And the BIS, by the way, has a very interesting history in that it was formed by Montague Norman of the Bank of England. He was governor, and Hjalmar Schacht of Germany's Reichsbank, and the BIS and the Bank of England, they did things during the war, like facilitating the theft of Czechoslovakia's gold and transferring it into the account of Germany in 1939, with the knowledge of Montague and really the participation of Montague Norman and Hjalmar Schacht through the BIS. So, the BIS, which has its shares owned by the other central banks, is an institution unto itself. But it seems to be at the center of the coordination of the gold rigging. To what end? Well, it's kept the paper money system going, but it's also resulted in the ability to strip an enormous amount of wealth out of the global financial system and really convert the global economy into a speculative economy. And then if you can move quickly enough and secure real assets, there's a tremendous benefit there for individuals who are involved in the financial system. There's also the second benefit, if we believe that this is a benefit, is to destabilize the system enough to restructure it to more of a globalist ideology or a globalist structure. Mm-hmm. And if that Zero Hedge article is correct, that is the intent, is to integrate these economies more closely, not totally with one world seeded power, but maybe a one world trade currency, which is controlled by a centralized group, and a system of taxes, and a digital monetary system, or a series of digital monetary systems that can be controlled from the center.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's when you look at the events of the last few years, you see, with the bailouts that have occurred, and with the Federal Reserve sending trillions of dollars to Europe, and the weakening of the Eurozone, clearly their economies are continuing to disintegrate. We've seen the other day interest rates once again spiking up in Greece, and then in Portugal and some of the other countries. It's clear that the European economic system is continuing to crumble, continuing to disintegrate and to implode, if you will, and so there's poverty and desperation, growing levels of it. I would argue that it's also happening in the United States to a lesser extent, perhaps, than in Europe, but it's clear to me this whole notion of destroy and conquer seems to be what's going on. Whether it's planned or not is another issue. I mean, I think there's some evidence, though, and you in your notes to me sent me some evidence from a very interesting central banker who basically sort of is confessing to this scheme.
Yeah. I mean the destabilization that we see in the markets right now, in terms of the rapid movement of interest rates in Greece, we can see over and over again that the symptoms have been addressed, but the underlying problems haven't been addressed. Mm-hmm. And because to address the underlying problems, you've got to go back to the roots of the system, and the system is one that benefits a very small coterie of individuals. Mm-hmm. But yeah, to your second point there, in terms of the admission, or was one of David Rockefeller's, and I've provided a link to you there from Wikipedia from David Rockefeller. But he made a very interesting statement in his book Memoirs, and he said, some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States. And that's an interesting or a very important note. There's a set of words, is working against the best interests of the United States.
Yeah.
Characterizing my family and me as internationalists of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. So the second part there is an explanation of further color, but the core there is working against the interests of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, one world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty, and I am proud of it. So he says he says, if you want to strip out the excess words there, he says, some believe we're part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States. If that's the charge, I stand guilty and I am proud of it.
Right.
So,
right.
I mean, when we look at these activities, there's one individual who's saying, well, this is what I'm doing, and then I'm proud of it. And then you say, well, wait a minute here. We have destabilizing policies here that are going to lead to monetary system chaos. And ultimately, the biggest concern is really starvation when you have monetary chaos, hyperinflation, as we saw in Germany. And you read some of these stories of Germany in the Weimar Republic and the violence towards farmers that occurred, and the murder and the looting and the complete chaos that broke out in a what was believed to be a civilized country.
Mm-hmm.
We should all be concerned.
Absolutely. Absolutely, so, we should be concerned. There's no question about it.
Yeah, we've got to address the underlying causes and issues and not address the symptoms with more juice in the system, which is what has happened to date. And we just don't see that happening, Jay.
Yeah. Well, we don't. And I mean, the whole premise of this radio show that I started back in 2009 was that we need to understand the underlying problem in order to solve it. We need to understand what the cause of 2008, 2009 was, and as you point out, nothing's been fixed. Basically, all they've done is address the symptoms, and they've not really gone to the root cause of it, which is a monetary system that is it's immoral. It's legalized theft. It does all kinds of bad things to people, causes them to turn against each other. It's disruptive. It's just horrible.
And fundamentally unstable, which I think is really the key.
Yeah, it is unstable, and we're seeing growing levels of volatility in the equity markets once again, which is, it looks like a playback to some earlier times, unfortunately. And if we could sit back here and see a European economy that was growing and prosperity, but my wife is Portuguese. We go back to Portugal once a year. We talk to people that are involved and living in that world, and it's not getting better. It's getting worse all the time. And now we're seeing another round of problems in Europe, especially among the southern countries, and all of them seem to be, again, their interest rates are starting to spike up. Sooner or later, it's just not going to continue to hold together, I'm afraid. But if that's what David Rockefeller and people are looking for, it looks like they're well on their way. And I would just say that those of us who care to try to do what we can, we got to let our friends know and our families know. I don't know about you, David, but I find when I talk to a lot of people about issues like this, they just really don't want to hear it.
Yeah, but I do think I agree with that, Jay. In general, those who don't pay attention to these things, it kind of harshes their mellow, if you want to call it that.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's an awakening happening in terms of people realizing the importance of monetary system stability, and there's very many people who really do care. Mm-hmm. And there's more who do than don't in terms of the interests, alignment of interests.
Sure.
And so I think we have to rely on that, and I do think that as people wake up here, that we're going to have people moving, and I hope it's not going to be too late in terms of system reform. But we don't have a whole lot of time to affect these changes. But there are patriots out there. There are people who really do deeply care about the success and stability of their countries, mm-hmm. and of the people around them. And I think that we have to just continue to talk about this in open and fair terms, and call it what it is, and then have the discussion about how we change things to prevent a calamity. The perfidy of a very small group of people, I don't think, is ultimately going to sway the day and set the tone for what happens. I think it's people like you and me and all the ones around us who are ultimately going to be successful. So we can only hope.
Thank you very much for that note, Dave, and look to talk to you again sometime in the near future.
Thank you, Jay.